All right, today I'm going to talk about the 15 new releases that I've read this year and how they could work on the bingo board for Newreleasathon, which is an August readathon that's happening. I'll have my announcement video down below, a playlist for everyone else's recommendations videos, and I will also have my recent release roundup playlist linked down below in case you want to just know about other new releases that you might want to have on your TBR. But this is also a video I tend to do every 6 months where I discuss new releases that I have read, and I typically do read 30-ish new releases a year, so the fact that I'm at 15 halfway through the year makes sense. And my list is just in the order in which I read them. I didn't feel like ranking them. We're just going to go from January to whatever I read in June or most recently. And let's get into it, starting with Goliath by Tochi Onyebuchi. I have a standalone review for this, so I will try to be brief where I have standalone reviews. But this is a book that will work for the one-word title for the bingo board. It's a BIPOC author, and I think it's a genre blending because it's literary and sci-fi. So for the bingo board, that's what I've got for you guys. In terms of what is this about, it is not far off future dystopian sci-fi where we are watching this moment in the future where people are coming back from the colonies. There was an inciting moment that really catalyzed the leaving of Earth to go live in the colonies, and we're watching people return, and what does that do to the communities of the people who were left behind. So it's definitely a view on gentrification. There's definitely discussions on race, climate, it deals with a lot of stuff that we are always constantly dealing with, and it does so within the lens of our right now. So I think it's not only important to read in the moment, but it's going to be so interesting to look back on in 50 years or something. I don't think it's as accessible as something like Parable of the Sower or other works like that, or like 1984. I don't think it's as accessible or as consumable because it's really tricky. I talk about in the review how it's nonlinear, it's disjointed, it's got a dense vocabulary. It also has cultural references that not everyone's going to know. It's not actually trying to hold your hand at any point. But I think it's as important as those works, especially in terms of capturing a moment in time and a lot of the stuff that we're thinking about in a specific lens. I really like it. I almost did DNF it. It's really not for everyone, but I love thinking about it. I love when people talk about it. We do have a channel in my Discord about Goliath, so you can also see a bunch of people's thoughts, ask questions, discuss it with people. It's a great time. The next one is completely different scope, and that's Hunt the Stars. This is a sci-fi romance. So genre blend again, and then it's also the start of a series, which works for one of the prompts for the bingo board. I liked this. The second book's actually already out, so that's another new release. I just haven't read that one. So there's 2 new releases for this author. I liked it. It has a lot of the same tropes that you will find in the Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J. Maas. So if you like those tropes, this is another way to get it. I think when the romance was the focus, I was having fun. When the plot was the focus, I was bored. This is a theme for me. I think a lot of people who did like this book actually felt like the plot was better paced, or they didn't like the parts that were slower in the plot, which were my favorite, which were like the small moments where I get to watch the team, get to talk to each other. But it's definitely like reluctant allies to lovers, or maybe even enemies to lovers. There's telepathy. It definitely, although sci-fi, feels a lot like a fae human romance, so just keep that in mind. And speaking of fae romance, the next one is House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas. This works for fantasy romance and sequel. I'm really not going to talk about this that much. I think you know if you're the type of person who wants to read this book. It is the second book in a series by Sarah J. Maas. Generally, most people have been disappointed by it in my circles. Some people still love it. You would have to read House of Earth and Blood first if you haven't already. And if you've read House of Earth and Blood, you already know if you want to read this book. So I'm just going to keep going. It was a disappointment for me, unfortunately. The next one I have is a novella. This won't work for hard mode because it's Tordotcom, but it's All the Horses of Iceland, and I really like this one. This one's genre blend is historical fantasy, and I think it would work really well for that, and this works for easy mode of author outside of the United States because this is a Canadian author. I really liked this. This got me to really geek out about time periods in Europe, so I think this is... I don't know, I hesitate to give it an exact time, but I think it's 6th century AD. It's very, very long time ago, and kind of a folklorish historical retelling of how horses went from Mongolia to Iceland, because there are horses on Iceland that have genetic similarities to horses in Mongolia, so it's a preposition of how did this happen, and we follow this man, so you're not really following horses so much as this trader man and how he travels the trade road to get these horses, and what happens along the way? Who do they run into? There's a tiny bit of magic, but it's mostly more akin to reading like The Bear and the Nightingale. And it's really short. I read it in a sitting. I liked the storyteller narrative voice that it had, and I thought it just really brought to life this region of the world that I knew so little about for this time period. So, highly recommend. Next up, we have How High We Go in the Dark. So this works for BIPOC author and a debut, for the debut box. This is also, I guess, maybe literary sci-fi. I feel like it's more science fiction and less literary, but I could see it being shelved there one day along with like Sea of Tranquility or something like that. This is one that I feel like everyone's just going to have to make their own opinions. It is a collection of short story vignettes. I keep calling it Depressing Love Actually, if you've ever watched that Christmas movie, where each story has a different perspective, but there's a thing that connects it to the previous story or a story coming after, whether it's a character or a location. Like, they're all interconnected, similarly to all the little stories in a movie like Love Actually. The premise of this is it's a climate pandemic sci-fi. This was actually written before COVID-19. And what's happening here is the permafrost melts and it causes a pandemic to start. And we are seeing society's response to that pandemic. My issue with it is not, I think, a very strong one. It's just that it fluctuates between the type of science fiction that it is, and I feel like wanted to use every sci-fi element the author loves, and I think that just has mixed success. Like, it goes from really, I think, grounded, hard sci-fi, real-world sci-fi to kind of metaphysical, abstract sci-fi fairly often, and a lot of people have mixed opinions on the end. But it was a very consumable read. Like, it's less than 300 pages. I really wanted to read it. I give books lots of points for wanting to know what happens next. So, take that as you will. Next up, we have a short story, Bloody Summer by Carmen Maria Machado. Works for BIPOC author, it works for short story, and no articles in the title, but not just one word. It's part of the short story collection that Amazon puts out. There's a bunch of authors for it. This is the one I read. I was thrown by this because I couldn't tell if it was actually a research document, because that's how it's written. It's written as someone documenting a time in a Pennsylvania town. And at first, I didn't know if we were getting the backstory to then do the speculative element, or if this was all fake. I was really confused, and I think that's a me thing. But it's definitely a good representation of Carmen Maria Machado and what she can do. And I would like to one day maybe read this entire collection and reread that story. I know my friend Evie liked it significantly more than me. I think my issue was I was confused about, wait, is this actually nonfiction? Because that's how well it was written in the format idea that it was conceived to be. This next one is actually on my shelf right here, and that's Kaikeyi. I have a review for this. I really loved it for the main character. This is definitely going to scratch an itch for people who like things that Madeline Miller writes, like Circe, but it will have mixed success. Like, I do know people who would love this book that didn't like Circe, and vice versa. Like, it's just a similar vein of taking older mythological religious texts, taking a lesser-known female character within that text, or a character that doesn't get as much page time, and giving them a larger representation of the story, usually with a feminine lens to it. And that's definitely what Kaikeyi is. And I, as from like a story perspective, loved it. I really liked Kaikeyi. I really liked the writing. I liked all of the interpersonal relationships. I liked how the magic system focused on interpersonal relationships. And it read to me like what I like when I'm reading mythology or religious tales, where, I don't know, there's a certain coziness to it that I got when I read this. So I will leave my review down below if you want to know more thoughts. I really enjoyed it. I was really hoping I would enjoy it, and I enjoyed it enough to buy a finished copy because I want to reread it one day. It was a very cozy time, and it's my favorite so far of all of the retellings that have been existing in the last 5 to 10 years. I just actually reread Circe recently, and I see the similarities, but I really like Kaikeyi infinitely more. Also, Kaikeyi would work for BIPOC author, one word in the title, debut, and there is ace representation within the book for Kaikeyi herself, so that will work for LGBTQ representation that is not L or G. Next book we have is The City Inside. This is a BIPOC author, and it's non-USA and in the global south, so it works for hard mode for that because the author is Indian. And this is an anti-dystopian book, similar vein to how I would say Goliath is literary sci-fi. I would also say this is literary sci-fi. This is, I think, easier to read. It is not non-linear. It's a straightforward beginning to end plot. I think the hard part is It is not a book that is about plot. We are meandering with these two kind of unlikable characters. Like, they're not mean characters, they're not bad people, but they are privileged individuals in a near future society where basically authoritarianism rules the day. You can't speak your mind or else you might be disappeared. Very modern day 1984 vibes, but it doesn't have the tension you would associate with 1984 per se. We're following these privileged individuals. One of them works with influencers and produces their feeds. And you kind of see them hating their reality, wanting to fight back, but not knowing how to resist. And they don't really need to resist because they are privileged. They are doing just fine. And so the story is less about resisting than getting to resisting. And it's very slice of life at times. So I think that means it's going to work differently for people. I really liked the writing, and I really like one of the characters, even though I do think who she is can be hard to get behind. I thought she was a great representation of that type of person. She felt very real to me, I guess is what I would say. So I really liked Joey. She was phenomenal, and I liked the writing style a lot, and I liked that it was short. I think if it was any longer, I wouldn't like it. The one thing I'm still not sure about if I like is the ending, but, like, that's me in a lot of open-ended, like, dystopian, anti-dystopian works. Also, sorry if you're hearing my cat. We're trying to train him, and in order to train a cat to not yell, you can't engage with them when they yell, and, so it's been a journey. Back to the books. The next one is another Tordotcom release, and that's Siren Queen by Nevo. Love this book. This is another one that's a BIPOC author. It has LGBTQ plus representation, and there are no articles in the title. This is a vibes story, as I say, and if you don't want the vibes, this book is not going to work for you. It's golden age of Hollywood, very dream-like magic qualities. We have this young woman, Chinese American, first generation, who loves film, goes to the movie theater to see the silent films, and then does what she can to become a star. And it's about her ascension to stardom and all of the magic involved. Like, there's literally, we're taking You Sell Your Soul to Hollywood and making that happen. There are monsters, there are blood deals. It's so cool. And, like, I think it really captures the magical feeling of Hollywood, that magical dreamlike quality. So it's a very soft, almost magical realism-ish magic style. His historical fantasy, so it does the genre blending stuff there for that square. And it's a really compelling tale of, this person and how she got to stardom. And it's not your typical one either, I don't think. So I really enjoyed it. It's, again, another short one. Nevo has amazing writing and storytelling chops, so definitely check that out. Also, in person, the cover shimmers so beautifully. I'm always tempted to pick myself up a copy. We have up next Discord of Gods, which I'm sure not many people are going to pick up for the readathon unless they've read the first four, but this came out this year. I have a series should you read for that entire series because I love it so much, and it's a sequel and a series ender, which is the hard mode for that square. It has all of the representation for LGBTQ+, and so it will also work for hard mode for that. What can I say? I love this book. I read the last 250 pages of this book in 24 hours. It's great. You should definitely check out my review if you want to know more. And this next one is also a favorite, and that is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. I don't really know what square it might work for, but I do think maybe potentially you could argue it's like a horror fantasy blend. I don't know. I think it's very light on the horror elements, but it depends on what is horrifying to you. I love this. I have yet to figure out how to talk about this. I did make a dark fairy tale recommendation video inspired by this because that's kind of like the lane this book is in. This is a story about Mara. She's a 30-year-old princess. She's the third princess of a family, so she's not important, but they need to keep her around for political reasons, and her two sisters have both been married to this cruel man, and she takes it upon herself to remove this man from the equation. And so when we start the book, it's very typical fairy tale structure of she has tasks to do for this witch, so then the witch will help her do the thing. And it goes from there. There's a goblin market. There's a team of people that come together. It is a dark atmosphere and aesthetic, but it is a whimsical tone, I think is what I would say. And it's whimsical in like Stardust, the movie whimsical, and I love it so much. And it has the slowest slow burn romance that I live for. I was rooting for demon chickens. There is a character that comes through about half or 2/3 of the way, and I adore her. T. Kingfisher does amazing work. I usually don't like quest stories. This is kind of a quest story, but I thought it just was paced so well. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It gave me all the things I want to feel when I'm reading a story like this. I love it. And I just love Mara. She's an amazing main character. She's a 30-year-old who doesn't really know where her life's going, and she's just trying to figure it out, and she's not afraid to say, I don't know. And I really appreciate that about her. Next up, we have The Ballad of Perilous Graves, which I read in May. This is a BIPOC author. It has a trans character. I'm putting as a non-US author, although the author has lived everywhere, so I guess you can decide, but I think Alex Jennings was raised in several countries in Africa, and it's a debut. This is a story about New Orleans and the songs that have been taken, and they need to go on a quest to get those songs back to save Nola. And it's confusing. It's really hard to explain the plot. The back of the book, I think, does not explain the plot well at all. But Perilous Graves is a young man who is adverse to magic. Magic is very tied to music, and he is trying to not be magical. But his best friend is basically a demigod, and his sister just loves to travel along with them. So there's a lot of, almost middle-grade tones with our cast of characters. But our trans main character is Casey, and he's like a 29-year-old man. So we also have that perspective. And we're basically just trying to save the soul of the city. I think this works well for people who love exploring cities. I don't think, if you didn't like the city we became because you didn't care about New York City and think you also don't care about, New Orleans, I'd be hesitant to recommend this type of work to you. It's definitely, a character study of a community, of a culture. And it's written in a very literary way. I would never give this to a kid because the pacing is not a very fast-paced book. It's a very inconsistently paced book. But I really loved reading it when I was in New Orleans, and I think it's very unique. I love seeing it in person. It has a map in it that I didn't have in my ARC that is so cool. So if you have a chance to see it in the bookstore, you gotta open it up. The map is awesome. So I can't really talk about a lot of the really cool things that I like about this book, because I do think those are meant to be discovered as you go. But it's definitely one of the most unique things I read this year, and even though I can recognize it didn't work 100% for me, I'm so happy it exists. Alright, down to the last three, we have Locklands, which will work as a sequel and series ender. This is the third book in the Founders Trilogy, which I just posted a review for the entire series. Also has LGBTQ representation, and this is a sci-fi, fantasy, sometimes horror book, and a one-word title. So those are the things it works for. What to say about the Founders Trilogy? Like I said, I do have this video, but essentially you have a world that works with this scriving magic, which is a way of manipulating reality by writing code onto objects, but it's very similar to scripting code language, and when you first start, you kind of are messing with Newtonian mechanics. But it kind of evolves from there, and Locklands takes place years after the events of the sequel Shorefall, and I have to be vague, because I can't tell you what happened in Shorefall. But we're following our cast of characters if they had to save the day, and it's always been a series that's plot-driven, that's how do we use this magic system and our skills to overcome this evil, also overcome society and how it's corrupt, that sort of thing. Check out that review if you want to know more. I loved it, thought it stuck the landing. We have Seasonal Fears by Shauna McGuire. This is written by a disabled author, and she's Romani, and a woman, so it's intersectional. There's no articles in the title, and this is a sequel. This, alas, did not work for me, which makes me so sad, because I love Middle Game so much. But it is what it is. This is the second book. I will say, I read this with my friend Jocelyn. She liked it more than Middle Game, and so I think if you didn't like Middle Game, Seasonal Fears might be better for you. I don't know if it's going to be a favorite of all time or blow you away, but it might work better for you because it does expand the alchemy world. It does provide more exposition and answers to questions in terms of how does this world work. I just really couldn't get behind the duo, and I think that's just partially why I was so disappointed, because there are very few people I love more than Roger and Dodger, which are the main duo in the first book. So I haven't given up on this series. And like I said, I do think there's an audience of people who will really like this. Even some fans of Middle Game might really like this. It's just, it's a 3.5 star when Middle Game is a 5.55 star. So it's just one of those things. All right, last book we're going to talk about is Daughter of the Moon Goddess. And this works as a debut by a BIPOC author who is non-US and from the Global South. So all of those things will work for this book if you want to read it. Also, contender for one of the most beautiful covers of the year. I had a really fun time with it. In the United States, and I think also the UK, it's published as an adult work, but I guess know if you're picking it up that it will remind you of a lot of tropes that you see in young adult and new adult works. Personally, I very much find it to be an adult work, but that's a constant thing that I've been hearing from friends who I read it with and other reviews, so just know that. Know that there's going to be a lot of focus on romance if you don't like that in your fantasy books, but I think it's a very mature approach to romance. I actually really identified with this book. The main character doesn't have an age because she's immortal. She's the daughter of the moon goddess. So we don't know how long she's been alive, but in terms of where she's at in life and the things she is juggling and figuring out, I really felt like she was like 24-year-old me, which was an adult, had to pay rent and taxes, so I identified to it as an adult person. And I just had fun with it. It has, cozy kingdom type, royalty fantasy elements to it. It has training montages. It has save the day elements. There were twists. There were turns. I wish it was like a tiny bit shorter, because there were parts that dragged a little for me. But in general, I had a really fun time, and the audio narrator is unmatched in her. She was so good. The narrator was phenomenal, so if you like audiobooks, highly recommend checking it out. And I just had fun. I think that's the biggest compliment I can give this book, is I was having a good time. I really liked the decisions that our character made based off the circumstances she was in. I thought the world was so colorful and magical. And so those are things that I was really hoping I'd get from this, and it delivered. So those are the 15 new releases that I've read this year. I don't think I've read anything more, because I've been reading a lot of 2021 books recently. So those are the 15, and those are my thoughts on all of those. All the information, like I said, will be down below. What are some new releases you've read that you think that I really need to prioritize and should maybe put on my TBR for August, because I'm still collecting all of my ideas for that. If you want to leave an emoji. Oh, let's leave a leaf for Seasonal Fears. I feel like I haven't done that yet. So a leaf for Seasonal Fears. And if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.